Welcome to this special edition, year-end special edition of Press Review, which is the reaction show where the reaction editors highlight the stories and pieces of writing and podcasts and all the rest of it that have grabbed their attention in the previous 7 days. But it's a slightly different show this year. We're going to cover the whole of the year and the big stories, and along the way mention a few of the things that we've liked most in terms of coverage. But the main purpose of this, with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and my colleagues Maggie Pagano and Alastair Benn, is to give our take on the biggest stories of the year. And I think we should probably begin, Maggie, just by acknowledging the vaccine. There's a lot of, as we're recording this, there's a lot of pessimism and concern about Omicron and variants and all the rest of it. But I think it's important, isn't it, to remember how far we've come and how strange things felt in Christmas last year, 2020, and early 2021. But the vaccine rollout did happen, and it worked, and it has saved lives.
And not only that, it was logistically the most phenomenal exercise. You know, within weeks, they had great big sporting venues open, volunteers, NHS, GP surgeries. I mean, it was deeply impressive to watch happen, actually. And as you say, if we thought back to this time last year, we would not have thought that, nearly 80% of the population now is double vaccinated. No, so it's been phenomenal. I think we have to say hats off where they're due to the government and the NHS for doing that.
Yeah, and they did. It's not going to do a. You know, it's not a global race, but Britain did actually. You know, Britain was a bit ahead of the curve, and ahead of the curve later in the year in terms of boosters. Probably some would argue still too slow, but I mean broadly, Alastair, it should be seen as a huge positive. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, as a a device which has given our health system sort of time to breathe, as it were, time to prioritize other care again, and given them space to give the best treatments to the people who need it. The vaccines have done an excellent job in general, but they haven't quite liberated us from some of the kind of questions posed to us by the pandemic, which we're still, I think, grappling with, and they've just given us breathing space, I think, and that's I think that's the best way to see vaccines. They're an intervention which just makes the other arguments perhaps less intense.
But when you say, Alastair, they haven't liberated us from that argument, you're getting it. It's a theme you've been writing and talking about throughout the crisis, that it's introduced a kind of soft authoritarian vibe to our politics, and a sort of safety first attitude, which really causes you a lot of concern in terms of the politics we're moving into.
Well, I think I quite like to use the example of the way things like Valium were marketed back in the mid-20th century, when these kind of mild tranquilizers came on the scene. They were marketed as solutions to everyday worries. So, and I'm getting this from this fantastic book, Empire of Pain. If you haven't read it, by David.
I've got it on the desk in front of me. It's actually it's really, really good.
Unbelievable book about the Sackler dynasty and the opioid crisis. But there's these great anecdotes about the kind of collision of marketing and medicine that happens in America in that period. And it's really interesting seeing that things like Valium were marketed as sort of cures for, one of the adverts reads, if you're afraid of school, like pop a Valium or another mild tranquilizer. And the same is always true now. I mean, these kind of medical interventions can do what they say on the packets, as it were, but they're not going to resolve kind of substantial questions about the nature of the state's authority, what kind of new balance we're going to strike between the state and the individual post-COVID, or still COVID, given the Omicron variant.
Okay, well, let's go then right back to the beginning of the year. So my main journalistic choice of the year is the writer Peggy Noonan. I've long been a huge fan of her work in the Wall Street Journal, and this she wrote a pair of columns The first of which on the 8th of January, so you'll know where I'm headed with this, just after the 6th of January, Capitol insurrection, and then a second column reflecting on it about 6 months later. And of course you had, I think the first one was headline, "Bring the insurrectionists to justice. The politicians who egged them on should also be made to a heavy price," in which she captured. She's Republican, American Republican, was close to Reagan, and some sensible mainstream conservative, and she just expressed beautifully in that column this sense of outrage about how do you deal with all that has just happened? Remember who we are, a great nation, a strong one. We have, since our beginning, been a miracle in the political history of man, brought much good. We are also in trouble, and there's no point not admitting it. And it's just this really heartfelt thing less than 48 hours after the extraordinary scenes, when, of course, that was inspired by Donald Trump sending his supporters to effectively march on the Capitol, and the security wasn't quite strong enough. They broke through, everything that ensued. But I think the big takeaway I have from it and from this year, and I'm certainly no fan of Joe Biden, but the transfer of power did happen. And whether you call it a coup or an insurrection or whatever it was, it didn't work, and there was a peaceful handover of power, certainly which following an election. And then the second piece from Peggy Noonan, it just explains, and it's called "Why We Can't Move On from January the 6th." And it's a beautiful line, and if you weren't appalled by what happened that day, you have given up on American democracy. And it just points a bit to the future in that the Trumpism, the Trump thing hasn't gone away. And it looks, even as you sort of get towards the end of the year, as though Donald Trump is probably the front runner to win the nomination. Maggie, how do you reflect on January the 6th? I remember, were as horrified as I was.
I felt I was watching one of those US movies. Actually, you couldn't quite believe this was happening. It really was in a sort of parallel universe. It's sort of, I suppose, what's wonderful to watch is, despite the horror of it and whatever went on behind it, it sort of managed to sort itself out. As you said, there was a peaceful transfer. The courts, the justice system, although some people would still disagree, they did sort of get to the right decision. Perhaps what's more worrying now is to see that really the debate doesn't seem to have moved on, does it? Biden seemed to be rather stuck in, well, both on foreign policy, what's happening with Russia, but domestically with this huge stimulus program and the economy, not doing very well. It does seem as though it needs a bit of a shake-up.
Yeah, the story of the year in the US, isn't it, is of a lot of people being, and among the US's friends as well, a lot of people being really relieved that Trump had gone, not wildly enthusiastic about Biden, but then he has, with fairly low expectations. I would say that he's disappointed. Also in press review terms, in terms of media coverage, it's quite remarkable to see the easy ride that he gets. And I read a lot of American press and consume a lot of American media. And Trump, of course, was brilliant for the news business, and was brilliant for traffic and for subscriptions of newspapers that hated him, like the New York Times or the Washington Post. So there's been this the Trump bubble in traffic terms, etc., and subscriptions sold has deflated in the US. There was a piece in the Washington Post about that just in the last few days. It's almost as though the media couldn't stand him, or much of the media couldn't stand him, but did really feast on him. Alastair, where are you at on this? Because it's been lots of people were really relieved that Trump was removed, that he was defeated electorally, and the election certainly wasn't stolen. He lost. He lost the election by 5 million votes. But then has Biden been a disappointment, or have you just taken this opportunity to tune out of American politics because the Trump horror show isn't there every day?
I think on the one thing where I am vaguely tuned into American politics, on the kind of geopolitics strategy side of things, we need to remind ourselves that the president doesn't have to be a genius. I don't know who was saying this last year. I can't remember, a commentator, maybe it was David Frum, saying, there have been, since the Second World War, there have been many American presidents. They've not all been sort of extraordinary thinkers or exceptional people. Some of them have been perfectly middle of the road and competent. And what you need in the American system is for someone to sort of take notice occasionally, because you've got this immense sort of hierarchy behind them. You've got the huge offices of state. You've got this sort of enormous system sort of generating stuff for the president. And I think what has happened in foreign policy, although the Afghanistan withdrawal, the manner of which its withdrawal is legitimate to be criticised, and there were lots of problems there. There is a growing sense of realism and a kind of Biden reset around realism, and that's
America feels you more normal and realistic than it did a year ago under Trump.
Just being a bit more, even if it's the Trump agenda in some ways, it's giving it a bit more of a solid multilateral basis. So things like AUKUS, what you often talk about, Ian, the kind of a coalition of the advanced democracies who have different ideologies, who might not be called necessarily the West, but a kind of broader notion of what the West might mean. You can see the kind of dynamics going on. And Biden is clearly setting that in train in one way or another. So he's letting the system reset, and he's empowering the system to do that. I don't know enough about American politics to know if that is broadly correct, but that's just what it strikes me as happening.
But it feels to me, and maybe a lot of other stuff has happened this year, and COVID obviously dominates. But if you wanted to be optimistic about the situation, you can detect over the course of the year, and we'll come to the fall of Kabul later on in press review. You can detect the beginnings of some kind of reorganization or rethinking of the West. That's why I think, a very unfashionable thought, and some people will scoff, but I think that what happened with AUKUS, which is the defense deal done this year between the US, the Brits and the Australians, that the forging of that pact, plus other stuff that's going on diplomatically in the background involving Japan and what's termed the D10 nations, effectively what our columnist Tim Marshall on geopolitics calls the advanced industrial democracies. Some new forms of organization are being born to try and challenge or contain China, and also what's happening with Russia. So I think that's certainly an improvement for me in foreign policy under Biden. So a couple of very important stories that we want to mention that were covered obviously very extensively. Should mention, Maggie, the kidnapping of Sarah Everard and the wider discussion that prompted in the media about violence against women.
It was truly horrendous and tragic death, and made more so because really of the players, the fact that he was a policeman, was a policeman, but was able to use clearly COVID type fear, if you like, to entrap her. It was horrendous, and it has highlighted, and hopefully there will be good that comes out of this, because it has highlighted, and I think a lot of men, fathers, family, men have perhaps understood far more now than they used to what it is like for women to walk home alone. And as a mother with 2 sons and 2 daughters, I think I've said this before, one of the worst things whilst they were growing up was when the daughters got to a certain age, you start telling them, be careful, don't walk home alone from the station, always call. Didn't say that to my sons. And I think we've had this conversation before, Alastair, and a lot of young males do feel that, but it is predominantly a female issue. And it's very sad that you even have to bring that up.
Yeah.
So hopefully out of tragedy will come a greater awareness. Let's hope so.
So the other another enormous story from 2021 was the European Championships, Alistair, which involved heartbreak for England, and of course Scotland during the European Championships had that extraordinary 0-0 victory over England. But how do you got very emotionally invested in it, and it just in media terms it just completely took over, didn't it?
I was less emotionally invested than I was in the World Cup, I must say, a few years ago, which for some reason I think partly because, and again, this is going to sound very sort of curmudgeonly, but it was the summer I felt was a period when there was a lot of COVID's sort of escarpments of the regulations that we had to follow. Like there was a lot of stuff that we were still having we all had to bow and scrape before this, even though most of us had 2 vaccines or were getting it, it was all very, lots of things just interfering with day-to-day life, whether it was booking or, all that stuff was going on at the same time as effectively a kind of state-sponsored COVID bonanza. I know so many people who went to games at the Euros who got COVID, and everyone there got COVID at the same time. And, all the politicians were slapping each other on the backs and all the dignitaries were being flown in. And there was just, I think it made visible something which has become more explicit in the last month, which is that, for the people in charge, the COVID regulations have been a kind of inconvenience to be sort of sidestepped when they feel like it, rather than a kind of something to abide by for public health, and that's why you can justify to yourself that you can have a party in the middle of lockdown, because
it's interesting because the next story I was the next story I was going to mention, though, I would just say on the European Championships, as a Scotland fan who supports England as long as they're not beating or playing Scotland, and I desperately wanted England to win. I mean, so let's not go over the trauma of that not happening. I just turned off the moment the penalty shootout was lost, and never really want to think about it again, and certainly never want to see it. It did feel really important for England to win, because it felt as though it was some kind of sporting hoodoo, or some psychological block, that if England, like Germany regularly wins stuff, France are used to winning stuff pretty regularly. The Spanish and the Italians sort of take it for granted to an extent. The English are still stuck in this 1966 time warp, which is boring and I think sort of psychologically destructive. So England needed to win, and it unfortunately it didn't happen. But you mentioned there lockdown breaking actions from government officials or ministers or the governing class, and I was going to mention the Matt Hancock affair, which is one of the biggest stories of the year, broken by the Sun, quite spectacular traditional style Sun splash, based on leaked CCTV footage. So this, that was the Sun. That was the Sun doing its sort of classic work. But I did encounter various. Maybe it's just me and people, government ministers who didn't want to see me. But I did encounter various examples of ministers who were very, very strict about the rules. Thinking back to a year ago, I can think of someone I know very well who was due to have dinner with and just said, "Look, it just feels as though I'm just taking a very, very kind of draconian attitude to the rules, and other people are being asked to follow the rules, and I'm just not meeting people for socializing and living quietly. So not everyone did as you describe, Alistair. On the Matt Hancock question, Maggie, it just did seem to go to the heart of something, which is then the other story we should flag in this context, of course, is Pippa Creра's scoop for the Mirror later in the year about number 10 parties, and maybe it's all connected with this, and maybe it's fed into this thing. The year ends, of course, with the Prime Minister getting a drubbing in a by-election. It really has connected with the public, this sense of one rule for them and one for the governing class and one for the rest of us.
Yes, I mean, to my mind, the most astonishing bit of the Matt Hancock story is the fact that he's had the chutzpah to sort of come back and apologize, do all the TV series GMB or whichever ones he's doing. And there was even talk that if there were a leadership challenge, he'd come back. I mean, what happened doesn't surprise me, because I think it was Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times last week tweeted, I'm hearing that Matt Hancock will put himself forward. So politicians, two things. They are mainly alpha males and females. They are people with big egos, need to feed those egos. So what happened, to him personally, it doesn't surprise me. But also, they reflect the general population. There's some who'll hide away, like a lot of us have done, hibernate for the last sort of year, and there are others who'll party. What we don't like, actually, what I think, and go on to the Boris by-election, I'm not sure people are that annoyed by the parties. They expect them. And we've not heard much from Labour or lots of various groups, because they were doing the same thing. What surprises me that they, at that stage of the game, were prepared to take the personal risk. They were all working there together. They stayed on and had a few bottles of wine. I mean, we know loads of people, all of us, who did the same. What I think the public don't like, and if we can move quickly on to the by-election, is sort of far more subtle ethical codes of conduct that are broken. For example, Owen Paterson in North Shropshire.
Yeah,
let's come.
Yeah, Maggie. Let's come back to that towards the end. Just no, not at all. But simply because there's quite a lot to cover there, and you've got a particular piece from Tom McTague in the Atlantic, a profile of Boris that you want to highlight, and it gets right to the heart of that. But we'll talk next about. We should mention, we haven't really mentioned Freedom Day, which we have talked about the vaccine rollout, but that was in July. Alastair, turns up, I mean, there was a lot of skepticism about that at the time, wasn't there, from the most draconian people on COVID who were worried that it was going to lead to disaster, and it didn't. It worked.
Yeah, and I think that something else has happened in 2021. We're almost in it's that the Churchillian thing, which has now become a cliche. When at the what was it? We're not at the end of the beginning, or the beginning of the end, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Ian quoted it in his piece last week.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I think we're in the foothills of
the end of the beginning
the end of the beginning, where we're in the foothills of a kind of a world in which COVID is. I mean, it's strange to say right now, given the situation, but we're getting there in terms of the therapies we have to stop. And the second thing is, 2021 was the year when a lot of the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, i.e. mask wearing or other forms of distancing, had a kind of real-world workout, and you started to see a sort of broader range of responses develop. As we're becoming sort of much more mature with how we think about COVID, in different countries, you saw responses quite radically diverge within small areas. In the UK, Scotland and Wales went for a more cautious summer. In Europe, probably went for a more cautious summer, and we're starting to see the real world performance of some of these changes. I think what worries me about the rhetoric of Freedom Day linked to vaccine rollout is we should never be tempted into premising what we conceive of as normality on the basis of a kind of efficient biomedical answer to the problems we're facing, because that leads you into a kind of world where, again, a kind of bureaucratic efficiency or a kind of clarity of distinguishing between people becomes prioritized over the kind of messier human values, and something is lost along the way. And I would always say, it's better to, the arguments we're having about mandatory vaccinations, vaccine passports that are followed from the rollout. It is better that the 10% of the population who refuse to get vaccines for whatever reason, because people will always have their funny reasons, not funny, or their own reasons for not getting vaccinated, as they have with the MMR. They've read something on the internet. They've spoken to a friend who said this. It's just not their priority. They're thinking about other things. It's far better to have the kind of like slight inefficiency of not being able to exclude them from society or radically intervening to make those people do what the majority have wanted. It's far better not to do that and to get there through experience, through persuasion, through the kind of time as it's going by.
I agree with you.
2021.
Yeah, I broadly agree with you, Alistair. But aren't we, Maggie, then in a situation where, that's fine in abstract terms, but the choices that they're making, and there are suggestions reported by the Times that, despite this incredible vaccine rollout in 2021, still towards the end of the year, a third to a quarter of Londoners, for example, are not vaccinated. So the choices that they're making, because of healthcare capacity, strain on the NHS, the strain on the supply chain because of workers having to isolate and all the rest of it. So the choices that they're taking, that Alastair describes, then have a knock-on impact on the rest of society and people who are being responsible and taking the vaccine.
I think it's a very muddled moral issue, but I would tend to agree more with Alastair, actually, which is that we should not make any medical intervention, and it's a basic human right under the Finnish human rights code, medical code. We should not force it on anyone. They do have sometimes weird and odd reasons. I want to step back a moment. I think we talked about how brilliant the vaccine rollout was. I think one of the flaws was that it was presented as a silver bullet, that this would transform everything. And in fact, I think it's only been sort of 6-9 months later that people have understood that even if you've had 20 vaccines, you can still be infected, and it's transmissible. You can pass it on. And I think that was a fundamental flaw, because it's probably whipped up a lot of the anger towards those who are not vaccinated. And we know that the vaccinated have even higher rates than the unvaccinated. So going back to, as you said, it's an abstract situation, but it's one that you can't solve. You're going to really, line people up and force at the extreme end is to line them up and force an injection. We can't do that. That's not the sort of society we live in. So it's through persuasion. Where you have to make the difficult decisions is, if you're a frontline NHS worker, should they be sacked if they haven't had it?
I see that. Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, but haven't we had? Isn't one of the big themes, and there's been so much reporting on the minutiae of this, and the debate has evolved so much. I think as people came to realise in the autumn, when the booster thing appeared, that actually, and the protection from the vaccine worth having, but really lasted sort of 5-6 months, and people are starting to calculate, well, are we going to need boosters for this, and then redevelop boosters for the next variant, and on it goes. I wonder if the bigger picture, though, isn't, Alistair and Maggie, isn't that we've got a glimpse with some of the scary stuff that the Austrians are doing, stuff that's happening around the world, the debate in Britain about what the next 10, 20 years is going to be like in terms of medical license meeting, or the requirement to be medically licensed to live normally, meeting technological capability, which is going to accelerate in the aftermath of the crisis, because it's like a war. After a war, stuff which was used in warfare is then applied in a civilian sphere, and you get huge leaps for good or for ill. And I thought this, talking to someone who come back from the US a week ago, and they were talking about vaccine passport requirements there, and institutionally and in infrastructure terms how shambolic the American thing was, with of course different rules for different states, and some people having shots on their phone of their vaccine statement proving they'd been vaxxed. And then they were quite impressed apparently by the British, not the only country that has this, lots of countries have it, but the British, because of the NHS and the scale of the database, obviously has this one-stop app with a QR code and the ability to then update that and add that to other things. And I just thought at that point, that's where over the course of the next 10, 20 years, the bureaucratic class is going to try and get to, Alastair. And what have we learned this year? Sorry to be gloomy about it. We've learned that probably about 60 to 70% of the population is up for that. And most of the Labour Party is, and at least half of the Tory party.
And there is a kind of shift in a lot of the anxieties. I talked about this before on the podcast. We have been afraid of pandemics in the noughties and the 90s. People talked about the fear of a next pandemic. And we had scares with swine flu. There was the anthrax scare. Again, top 5 most searched items in 2001 was anthrax. So there were a lot of latent fears of a kind of biohazards release, a biobomb. What was a huge aspect of the WMDs was this idea of using a kind of a biobomb on Western cities. It's been an anxiety lurking there for decades, and buttressed by all kinds of cultural kind of events and phenomenon. And now with COVID, it's as if it's all come true. We had what seems now to be a leak from a lab in China, which some people claim is engineered, and we're going to get into a kind of world where people are even more afraid than we already were of the capacities of the kind of advanced biological sciences to go wrong. So, and this is the thing that the top intelligence services around the world are thinking about.
Biosecurity, once we get through whatever comes next with Omicron or later variants, biosecurity is going to become a big and dominant theme in politics. Britain has a biosciences industry and a bit of a tech lead in terms of tech investment. You add all that together, and plus with the UK sort of intelligence reputation, intelligence and security, this is going to feature large in our politics, and I'm not sure where the opposition is going to go. Well, I can see individual Tory MPs who are going to oppose it, and some Labour MPs who are going to oppose it, but I doubt that the voters will. And a lot will be got away with on the basis of sort of safety first. And we're used to thinking about technology in terms of the tech giants and the threat from Facebook or Google, or what they're doing in terms of screen habits and attention spans and all the rest of it. But actually, this biosecurity, license to live stuff, and regularly testing. You think how we're all now submitting. I'm not necessarily criticizing. I think the development of the lateral flow test, as Adam Bolton says, one of the most remarkable things about the last year that we now just take for granted, that you sort of take this, it arrives, you take this thing, scan the code, and then expect or if you take PCR, then get the feedback from the government, which sort of tells you to stay indoors for 10 days. I doubt that the British state is going to retire that power and ability to control in the light of what's coming. Shall we move on to? Let's move on briefly to the fall of Kabul. Well, not briefly; it's a massive story. But Alastair, let's talk a bit about the fall of Kabul. I'll just say to those of you who are just tuning in, you are listening and watching Reaction. This is Press Review, the show where we analyse the stories that have grabbed the attention of the editors from the Reaction team. If you're not a member of Reaction and you want to get my weekly newsletter, Maggie's column, and Tim Marshall on geopolitics and lots of other stuff, which is for members of Reaction, become a member below. And also on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button and get more of these videos. But Alastair, fall of Kabul, you had something to highlight, great proper old school reporting.
So I think the John Simpson, who is he around 80 years old? I
should know, but yeah.
No, he's not 80. Sorry, is he?
No.
Anyway, venerable BBC journalist, and he just brilliant reporting throughout the whole crisis. Very illuminating. Actually, what he illuminated, not just in articles he wrote for magazines, but in his reports again and again and again, is that although the Afghan involvement for the West and the NATO alliance has been a sort of dark chapter in our kind of modern history, it's part of an ongoing tragedy for the Afghan people that started decades ago, and that is still unfolding. And I felt that throughout all his coverage, that was what he was bringing out over and over again. Speaking to everyone, speaking to all sides, and again sticking at it after the formal withdrawal of our presence, and illuminating what's continuing to go on, the aftermath, the problems with food, with money supply, all that stuff. I just thought comparable to Jonathan Rugman at Channel 4 during the Islamic State Yazidi period, where he was just the guy pulling in amazing reports over and over again. I thought John Simpson was that character.
Another reporter I'd like to highlight from this year's work of Anthony Lloyd, Crisis After Crisis does it, and his reporting on the ground during and then immediately after the fall of Kabul, and getting alongside and reporting the arrival of, getting alongside the Taliban and reporting their takeover from an eyewitness perspective, I just found gripping day after day after day. I mean, do you feel, Maggie, it is one of the biggest stories of the year? Does it represent for you major American retreat and failure, or is it a bit like the fall of Saigon in 1975, where that looked immediately at the time as though the Americans were finished or were in retreat, and actually within 5 to 10 years they came bouncing back in the Cold War in a way that not a lot of people predicted at the time?
I always felt that the Americans were there on a false premise, and a lot of their ambitions were deeply flawed. So, and we know that Biden, going back 30 years ago, said he was totally against it, wasn't he? And Trump, of course, started the withdrawal. So I think it was the right thing to do, but they obviously did it. It was badly executed. And my hope now really is, and I believe Britain should be involved too, is that we need to help in the reconstruction. We do not want to leave Afghanistan to the hands of the Chinese, who are exploiting particularly their natural resources. It's hugely rich country. And
in terms of natural resources, potentially,
resources, aluminium, copper, I mean, they've got everything. But sadly, for the last century, they've relied on opium. It's sort of slightly mad.
Yeah.
So I would hope I I don't think it's the end of empire or anything like that. I just think, I don't like the expression, but it's a reset, badly done, and clearly not in great coordination with Britain and with France and the other NATO troops. And as the whistleblower showed last week before, clearly something was going wrong here within the Civil Service, Foreign Office, helping people out. But yeah, no, we need to have even closer ties. But the idea, that the Americans were there to sort of, and help women of Afghanistan freedom, I thought that, that if they were really trying to do it, they didn't understand the nature of the society there. It is still so tribal. There are better ways of helping, which is probably building water pumps, sanitation, giving.
They did do that as well. The Americans, not claiming it as a foreign policy success. Of course, the aftermath is a disaster, but there were millions of Afghans who got an education, a shot at an education, and relative, improved life once the Taliban were removed after 9/11, who would not have had that chance. Now, many, of course, exiled or refugees. But I think let's move on. You mentioned there, Maggie. You mentioned copper and aluminium and lithium, I think, and all manner of other things. Let's talk about energy and supply chains, because that's a big theme of 2021, and also feeds into the big economic theme of the year is inflation.
Absolutely, which has probably fed through. Yeah, and actually, I do want to highlight one journalist stroke market analyst, one at Reuters, John Kemp, and Javier Blas at Bloomberg, who have really been on this subject right from the beginning. And they're quite techy, and it's all charts, but they have been following what's been happening in the gas and the various other energy markets brilliantly from the beginning. And actually there's a big warning for next week, because we're going to get this snowstorm and people are talking about maybe power cuts. So because no wind, no solar output, we're going to be relying totally on gas.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, time of the year. Yeah, just to cheer everybody up. So, I mean, there are lots of reasons, aren't there? The whole logistics, because ships were stopped in ports, people weren't mining in the factories. And so you had the whole supply chain crisis, which meant blockage, shortages. And at the same time, you have Putin in Russia, who supplies Europe with most of our gas, was able to, hold it back, if you like. And it perhaps showed how vulnerable we are, particularly in Britain, to overseas suppliers. Norway, I think we can rely on, but Russia, and also the interconnected pipes that come through from France. And you remember the whole debate in Jersey when the fishermen were fighting. They were threatening to turn off their energy supplies. We are very vulnerable. Yeah. So maybe we're also very short-sighted in trying to switch too much to the so-called renewables.
Yeah, I mean, Neil Ferguson, who we hosted, of course, this year with a live event, a return to live events when it seemed as though the world was getting back completely to normal last summer at the Garrick Theatre. And in a piece towards the end of 2021, Neil, in Bloomberg Opinion, painted this as really, it's quite a gloomy piece, but painted this as being about the end of globalization, or deglobalization, certainly the end of this phase of globalization, with people not wanting to rely on overly long supply chains, and the tension that's potentially where, because central bankers have spent the second half of the year trying to figure out where this inflation is coming from. Is it, as they described it, transitory, or was low inflation for most of the previous 20-25 years really about China coming on stream, technology keeping prices down, availability of cheap goods from the developing world, and now we're through that phase, and this inflation might be a bit more sustained. They don't really know. We should mention, I mean, I don't think anyone wants to hear COP26 discussed again, but we should mention that it happened. And if you do, Maggie, if there are the stress and strain on the power system and the electricity, etc., in in a cold winter, then some of the stuff that was said at COP26 is going to look pretty silly. And then I think we're going to move on, Maggie, to you had a piece you wanted to highlight from Tom McTague in the Atlantic, which we mentioned in the context of what's dominated in UK terms, other than the virus, is Tory sleaze, resignation of Owen Paterson, and everything that's flowed from that. But Tom McTague's piece you wanted to mention.
Yeah, well, I would also recommend read just about anything that Tom McTague writes.
He's great.
He is fabulous, yeah. And this was just a particularly good piece. He went round with him. He visited him with a new tram. He went to Hartlepool and then sat down and interviewed him. And I really felt he got a very good sense of Boris and how he didn't actually use the word jelly, but he said, one of the things, his genius is that he prevents the opposition, those that don't like him, and there are many within his own party and voters as well as Labour, that they can't think straight. He plays so many different games that it's very difficult to pin anything on him. However, this by-election, I think, is not so much, my own interpretation is that this was very much you always get protest votes midterm, but this was a protest vote with people very disappointed in Owen Paterson's behaviour, one, because as we know, he could have avoided this. He could have accepted the committee's sanctions. He could have had censure of 7 days, potentially, or 30 days. Everyone would have forgotten about it. So he didn't. And then you had Boris compounding it. And I think it was the sense of sort of sleazy, corrupt. That's why I was saying earlier on, I think the parties people would just sort of brush off. But this was different. This was your local MP raking in hundreds of thousands of pounds a year from somebody making money out of COVID. It had, didn't pass the smell test.
That piece by, yeah, it does. But and I think you're right. That's what should really worry the Tories out of this, is that it's not necessarily a temporary thing. It's something deeper and ethical, and people are cynical and skeptical about politics, but just this sense that that those in authority are at it, and the Brits have wrestled with this since the expenses crisis, and beyond that, going back to the 1990s. But if the Tories find themselves on the wrong side of that again consistently, or Boris does, then this is not just a temporary blip. But the Tom McTague piece did get to. Well, it got to the heart of quite a lot of things. A very important piece this year, and he did get a lot of time with Boris and good insights into him. But one of the things which came through, and which applies directly to the Paterson disaster for the Tories, is that Boris, Alastair, doesn't really sort of think. Well, it's not. He just doesn't think that the rules apply to him. He has, and it's served him well until now, a kind of contempt for media sanctimony and rows and being pursued over his own misbehaviour. He prefers to kind of brush it off, which is what he tried to do with the Paterson thing effectively, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he's and in doing so, he sort of effectively made it open season on just about any MP who had a second job. I mean, it was then a story, and appeared, all the tabloids were pursuing it, and that obviously made him more unpopular with the parliamentary party. I think what we need to always bear in mind with Boris and with the Tory party is, no matter what people say about this administration being a new Tory party or a reset or a new party in the minds of voters, it's not true. Gravity eventually comes to you, whether you're a great sports team or you've got a great election winning formula.
Yeah,
the processes break down. The relationship between the bits that maybe worked well 5 years ago doesn't work quite so well. The machinery, whether it's the party HQ not working with number 10, or with number 10 not working with the rest of government, it becomes tired. Just the same personalities come around, again and again. They get tired, and I think there is, whatever Boris's energy is, or his great shape-shifting qualities, or his brilliant persona, all that stuff, it just eventually stuff gets to the party which has been in charge for ages, and that's just a reality. It sounds a very basic thing to say, but it's just like,
it's a cycle, isn't it? Which is why I sort of think Boris, I've changed my mind in the last day or so. I think he's going to survive this. And it's partly because there's nobody that I can see with the sort of energy or the ideas or the rigor or the vigor who could challenge him. I mean, you know, who would excite you? Who would be any better than him? So,
well, I talked to Tim Montgomery on for a reaction on this, and those who've listened to the podcast or listened to that video will know his view, and we disagreed on it a little bit. I mean, I think the Tories always before they change leader, they can never decide who it is or who would be better until they do. And you know, it's very, very often the case that they sort of dither around, and then eventually something provides a trigger for a leadership contest, and the whole thing unfolds. I think I disagree with you slightly, Maggie. I just think it feels to me at the end of this year, I mean, considering we started talking about the vaccine rollout, to have had that incredible success on one level, but to end the year in political disgrace, having lost a safe Tory seat on a majority of 34% in a Leave area. I think those ethical concerns and the voters really having had enough, I think something deeper has happened. But can I ask you both, do you think that Boris Johnson will still be Prime Minister in a year's time? This is the end of 2021 special edition of Press Review. Maggie, do you think he's there in a year?
Yes.
Alastair?
No, just because I can't say yes as well. I'm gonna go for.
We'll share the winnings, Alastair.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Dominic Cummings that he'll be out by the summer, because he's gonna get something's gonna get him, and he's just stored up so much stuff. It's just a lot of stuff, you know. That's what I was trying to say with the kind of over time, things do just, they start solidifying, and you know, something will stick which might not have stuck before, or something that didn't stick will suddenly become much more important because of political gravity. And also we have to remember, which is something that, you know, again, this whole great reset at the heart of the Tory party, moving to a kind of working class blue Labour style conservatism. So a story that people have endlessly sort of re-engineered over the last few years. Now, you know, they did in 2019. It was a pretty astonishing victory, but it wasn't all that astonishing. If you were up close with British politics at the time, there had been 3 years of utter nincompoopery in Parliament, utter shenanigans, where the governing class had been talking to itself.
Yeah.
And it just looked ridiculous after a while. I remember almost throwing my phone into a field when Oliver Letwin introduced his amendment. It was just irritating. And Boris and the people around him, whether it was Cummings, who, you know, understood that the public just wanted someone to put an end to it.
Yeah.
And Boris was the guy, Boris was lucky enough to be there and to put the right personalities around him. People didn't vote for him because there was this great cultural revolution going on. I think they wanted to get Brexit done, and they wanted to bring some clarity to the kind of shenanigans that were going on. And
okay,
that's what happened. I think.
So final question to you both. What are your hopes? I was going to say hopes and fears, but emphasis on hopes, but maybe some fears as well, for next year, for 2022. Maggie?
I hope that the Omicron variant is the last dregs, if you like, of this horrible virus, and that it becomes truly endemic, and that we have full herd immunity and it disappears, and that we can get back to some sort of, if any of us can remember what normality is. That would be terrific if that and that it does work itself into a coronavirus cold.
Yeah.
Because I think the way people Well, it's just doing our heads in, isn't it? Living in this constant state of anxiety and fear is not healthy. Or, very quickly picking up on Alastair's point, and something you forgot, Alastair, is that when they start putting chips into our bodies, but if we live with it, then we have to learn new risk. We'll have to learn different behaviors, because we cannot lock down, we cannot stop traveling, we cannot stop. Humans are not, we're more dynamic. We've got to re-find our confidence and courage.
Yeah, the point of life is to live it rather than just to live in, exist in fear. Alistair, what's your hope for next year?
Just something that's really struck me is I hope that whatever the outcome of the French presidential election next year, that there can be some sort of reset with the Anglo-French relationship, because there's been so much bickering over the last year. Some of it justified. Certainly the French were justified in their in the response to the way AUKUS was presented and the kind of lack of statecraft from the US. And I just think we have got to be a bit, I think it's what we were saying. I just hope that I think there are some green shoots in terms of some really hard, realistic thinking about our kind of geopolitical problems and about who we need to give good answers to those problems. And I hope that we can kind of, with France, realize that we've got a lot more interests in common than divide us. And also, second to that is Germany. I hope that Scholz is someone who again takes on kind of, breaks down the kind of culture of politesse, the heart of German politics, where they seem to refuse to discuss some of the external realities that Germany is creating in Europe with its foreign attitude towards foreign policy, its reliance on the Chinese market, its reliance on Russia's natural gas reserves in the future. Come on, have some hard thinking, and let's have a more realistic conversation about Europe's security and how that might look in the future.
It's very interesting. Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And it does. I'm not suggesting that the Brits are going to change leader, because the Germans are going to have changed leader to Olaf Scholz this year, which is a big deal. And Merkel is gone. We didn't get time to mention that. But also Pécresse could take out Macron. So you have the possibility of a new leader in Germany, Pécresse. I mean, isn't there the possibility there of imagining Alastair kind of Rishi Sunak and Pécresse? You can imagine an Anglo-French summit, can't you, where the Macron and Boris years are put behind the two nations, and there's so much cooperation on security and defence and culturally anyway that you could reset on that basis.
Absolutely. And the thing that is worrying about France is that French politics is taking a profoundly hard rights turn, and the language of French politics is the kind of limits of what you could say about issues of identity, of immigration, all that. It's gone way to the right, and the fact that our closest neighbour may have a kind of a new alignment in that way, it potentially offers some dangers to us, in that our kind of there is something different going on in French politics than over the last 20 years, and it also represents opportunities in terms of I think Pécresse is an interesting development, probably would be very friendly to someone like Sunak. So it's not all bad, but there is, in French politics, there is a serious thing going on, which has been going on for some time, but is really coming to a fore now, which is the kind of vocabulary of politics is way to the right of British politics at the moment.
I'm not saying that they compare it precisely. However, you could say, as the author Alwyn Turner, who I interviewed recently, and it's going out soon on Reaction for our Author in Conversation series, made the point that maybe because the French don't have an outlet like Brexit, that's how what you described manifests itself in presidential politics, whereas the British could channel a lot of that discontent about identity into something actually really quite mainstream, which was against Brussels and leaving the European Union. But Maggie, you've got money on Progress winning next year, haven't you?
Yeah, yes, I have, and I think she will be friendly, whether it's still Boris in power or Sunak or Liz Truss or Kenny Badenoch, whoever were to take over. I have two things about the French to say. One is that not that they didn't have Brexit. There is a view in France that they don't have their tabloid newspapers like we do in Britain, where so much of that sort of angst and anger and colour is allowed to ferment in a way. There's much quieter. I mean, you've got a few now growing on the extreme. So, and that's why they end up by, protests and revolution on the streets. They're much more symbolic, whereas we have a lot more of that debate going on.
Yeah.
What I do think, I'm not as worried as you, Alastair. I think all the sort of that pent up supposed support for Le Pen and now Zemmour is not froth, but it's needed to come out because it doesn't come out in these other outlets. But a lot of it at the last moment, both those characters are too unpalatable to vote for. So a lot of that middle centre right, if you like, will switch to Progress. And she has said, I think, on many occasions that for her Brexit is done and that she wants good relations. So one would hope it would calm down. The other interesting thing going on in France is that there's quite a lot more people are outing themselves as Catholics. That it's sort of whole Catholicism was rather suppressed in some ways for years. So there is this sort of Catholic tradition that is coming to the fore.
And then connected to that, Maggie, is this, and the BBC actually had a piece about this the other day, is this backlash against wokeism, as they term it, which is to do with, it's a new manifestation of this French cultural concern about American cultural dominance. And as the French culture minister, I think earlier this month, made the point, well, look, it's France. It's an old civilization, and it doesn't need to import its values and be told how to live according to American debates about race, ethics, behavior, politics. This is France. So you've got all of that happening simultaneously.
Yeah, I think we carried a piece too. There was a move to have a new pronoun for il and elle, and so it was IEL was the sort of the third one, but it's been completely squashed.
That's the interesting thing about France is that the media class, the political class, even the kind of academic class, and broad sort of swathe of opinion is pretty much aligned on these things. Well, we will find out next year on the French presidential election, and we'll cover all of that and much more in 2022 on Reaction on these videos, press review, where we analyse the stories that grab us, and all sorts of other videos, but also on the main site, where if you become one of our members, you get my weekly newsletter and all sorts of other things from the Reaction team. So, and the details are just below here. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button to be alerted to more of these videos. But until next year, thank Maggie and thank Alastair, and thank you for watching and listening.